When my daughter-in-law whispered, "She's just a leftover from another era," at our family Thanksgiving dinner, and my son suggested I retire to a facility with people your own age, I didn't create a scene or sever family ties. Instead, I channeled my 50 years of culinary expertise into transforming the abandoned historic restaurant they were planning to demolish into Heritage Table, a multigenerational cooking school and community kitchen that now serves thousands of meals weekly to food-insecure families while preserving our town's culinary traditions through classes taught by seniors like me. As my bewildered son watches the luxury condos he'd planned to build become the nourishing heart of our community and a living testament to the wisdom he tried to discard. Before I continue my story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever been underestimated because of your age. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I'm going to share the 3-ingredient recipe that launched our most popular community program and changed how our town thinks about feeding families in need. My name is Martha Sullivan, and at 73 years old, I discovered that sometimes the most painful dismissals can become catalysts for creating something far more nourishing than we ever imagined possible. For nearly 5 decades, I devoted my life to food and community, starting as a home economics teacher in our small town of Millfield, and eventually becoming the culinary director for one of the most innovative farm-to-table programs in our state. What began as a simple substitute position in 1972, when I stepped in after another teacher left mid-year during a difficult divorce, blossomed into a career that nourished thousands of families and established cooking programs that continue, serving our community to this day. In the early days, I worked endless hours in our modest farmhouse kitchen, with my husband Thomas helping with everything from chopping vegetables to building the teaching garden behind our home. We saved carefully until we could afford the down payment on what everyone in town called the old McIntyre house, a stately Victorian near the town square that had beautiful bones but needed considerable work after sitting vacant for several years. That house became our life's project. Thomas, with his remarkable carpentry skills and endless patience, spent weekends restoring the original kitchen with its walk-in pantry, repairing the wraparound porch where we'd host community canning sessions, and gradually bringing each room back to its original character. I learned to restore vintage cookbooks, plan historically accurate heritage meals, and research traditional cooking methods from the diverse cultures that had shaped our region. The kitchen became the heart of our restoration. We hunted through salvage yards to find period-appropriate fixtures, restored the original soapstone sink that weighed nearly 300 pounds, and carefully stripped decades of paint from the beadboard walls to reveal the warm patina of century-old pine beneath. Thomas crafted custom cabinets based on historical designs that would accommodate modern appliances while maintaining the kitchen's historical integrity. Friends would shake their heads at our passion for historical accuracy, suggesting we'd be better off with modern conveniences and contemporary design. "A kitchen with history has recipes embedded in its walls," Thomas would say when friends questioned our seemingly endless project. These old homes were built to gather families and nurture community, not just serve as real estate investments. The house wasn't just architecturally charming, it had a unique placement in our neighborhood. Situated directly beside the historic Millfield restaurant that had once been the culinary heart of our area, our property shared a generous side yard that blended into the restaurant's gardens. For decades, this arrangement created a natural flow between our home and the restaurant space, with neighborhood gatherings often spilling from one property to the other during harvest festivals and holiday celebrations. The Millfield restaurant itself was a town landmark, a fieldstone building that had begun as a stagecoach stop in 1870 and evolved through various iterations before becoming the beloved eatery that had hosted generations of family celebrations, community meetings, and Sunday dinners. Its wide plank floors had been worn smooth by over a century of footsteps, and the massive hearth still functioned as both heating source and cooking space during winter months. The restaurant's garden supplied much of its produce, with heritage varieties that had been grown on the property for decades. Thomas and I had always been deeply involved with the restaurant, volunteering to maintain the kitchen gardens and helping organize community meals during difficult times. When financial hardship threatened the restaurant's closure in the 1990s, we helped establish a neighborhood food cooperative that kept the doors open through volunteer staffing and community-supported agriculture. The restaurant became known for its monthly community dinners, which I coordinated using seasonal ingredients and traditional methods from our region's diverse culinary heritage. These community meals became beloved events that brought together people from all walks of life. We'd serve everything from Pennsylvania Dutch scrapple to Polish pierogi to Southern-influenced stews that reflected the varied cultural heritage of our region. Each dish came with stories told by the elders who had preserved these recipes. Stories of immigration and adaptation, of hardship overcome through shared meals, of cultural identity maintained through food traditions even as other aspects of heritage faded with assimilation. Communities need gathering tables as much as individuals need homes, Thomas would often say. The strength of a neighborhood isn't measured by property values, but by how people come together to break bread in shared spaces. Our son Jeffrey had never shared our passion for food traditions or community building. From an early age, his interests pulled in different directions. Always drawn to finance and focused on material success, he pursued a career in real estate development, gradually building a company specializing in luxury condominiums and upscale commercial properties throughout the region. While I was proud of his business acumen, I often worried about the disconnect between his values and the community-focused principles Thomas and I had tried to instill. As a child, Jeffrey had shown flashes of interest in our work, eagerly helping, harvest vegetables from the garden, and proudly carrying dishes to the community table at events. But as he entered his teenage years, his focus shifted dramatically toward markers of status and financial success. The turning point came during his freshman year of high school when he was embarrassed by our modest lifestyle during a visit from more affluent friends. After that, he began actively distancing himself from our community work, describing it as charity rather than the mutual aid and shared abundance we considered it to be. As Jeffrey established his own success, our differences became increasingly apparent. His visits home grew less frequent and more perfunctory. When he did come, conversations inevitably turned to the untapped potential of our property and the inefficient use of space represented by the historic restaurant next door. "Mom, do you realize what this location could be worth with proper development?" he would ask, surveying our yard with the calculating eye of a developer rather than the affection of a son who had grown up harvesting tomatoes from the garden that shaded both properties. "This whole block is prime for high-end residential conversion given its proximity to downtown." I would gently remind him that neighborhoods needed more than expensive housing to thrive. They needed spaces where people connected, where families felt welcome, where community identity developed through shared meals and preserved traditions. These conversations usually ended with Jeffrey's polite but dismissive nod, the kind that acknowledged my words without absorbing their meaning. His marriage to Diane 5 years after college further widened the gulf between our worlds. She came from a wealthy family with no connection to our town's history or traditions and viewed our community-centered lifestyle with poorly disguised disdain. Their wedding featured catered food from a trendy restaurant in the city rather than the community-supported celebration we had envisioned. When they bought their first home, it was in an exclusive gated community 30 miles away, effectively removing them from the neighborhood networks that had shaped Jeffrey's childhood. After Thomas's unexpected stroke 6 years ago, the restaurant became even more significant to me. While grieving, I poured energy into expanding its community programs, establishing a senior cooking circle alongside the children's culinary classes. This intergenerational approach created something magical. Older adults finding purpose through sharing family recipes with children, while young people benefited from the patience and wisdom their older cooking partners provided. We developed a kitchen wisdom program where seniors taught traditional cooking methods that required no expensive equipment, techniques for bread making, preservation, and transforming humble ingredients into nourishing meals. Children who participated not only learned practical skills, but absorbed stories and cultural history that connected them to the broader community heritage. The seniors, many of whom lived alone and struggled with isolation, found renewed purpose and social connection through teaching. The restaurant kitchen became my second home during those difficult months of adjustment to widowhood. The rhythms of food preparation, the children's laughter as they mastered new skills, and the sense of purpose in mentoring both young cooks and older volunteers provided structure when my personal life felt untethered by grief. Thomas had always been the one who believed in the restaurant's importance to our town's identity. Continuing this work became my way of honoring his memory while rebuilding my own life. Unfortunately, the restaurant faced increasing financial challenges despite its community significance. The building required substantial maintenance that the cooperative could barely afford, and changing dining habits meant fewer regular customers supporting the establishment. By the time I turned 73, the restaurant had reduced its operations to weekend service only, with community programs continuing on a volunteer basis during weekdays. When I reached my 73rd birthday, Jeffrey's suggestions about downsizing and appropriate senior living options became more frequent and direct. Though I remained active and fully capable of maintaining my home with occasional help from neighborhood teenagers, he increasingly framed his concerns in terms of my long-term security and practical planning. While I recognized the genuine concern behind some of his suggestions, I also sensed the developer's calculations beneath his words. "The neighborhood is changing, Mom," he noted during one visit, carefully casual as he mentioned new zoning proposals that might affect property values. "It makes sense to consider your options while you can still maximize your investment in this place." I had always been transparent about my intentions. I planned to leave the house to Jeffrey eventually, but wanted to remain there as long as possible. We had discussed a life estate arrangement that would give him ownership while ensuring my right to live in the home throughout my lifetime. This approach seemed to balance his interest in eventually acquiring the property with my desire to remain in the community I loved. The life estate documents were drawn up by my longtime friend Eleanor, who had practiced elder law before her retirement. She had carefully structured the arrangement to protect my interests while acknowledging Jeffrey's eventual inheritance of the property. The document clearly specified my right to occupy the home throughout my lifetime, with Jeffrey gaining ownership but not possession until after my death. "This protects you while giving Jeffrey the security of knowing the property will eventually be his," Eleanor explained as we finalized the paperwork. "It's a common arrangement that balances current needs with future planning." I signed the documents with mixed emotions, grateful for the security they provided, but saddened by the necessity of such formal protections within a family. Thomas and I had always operated on trust and shared values. The need for legal safeguards with our son represented a disconnect that no document could truly bridge. The invitation to host Thanksgiving came from Jeffrey and Diane rather unexpectedly. In previous years, they had always cited their busy schedules and preference for meeting at restaurants rather than family homes. Their sudden enthusiasm for a traditional family Thanksgiving at their place struck me as unusual, but I was genuinely touched by what seemed like a gesture toward reconnection, especially when they suggested I bring my signature heritage recipes that Thomas had always loved. I spent days preparing dishes that represented our family's culinary history: corn pudding from Thomas's southern grandmother, pierogi from my Polish great-aunt, and the special cranberry chutney that had been served at every Sullivan Thanksgiving for generations. Each dish carried stories and connections to people long gone, but remembered through the foods they had taught us to prepare and share. The cranberry chutney was particularly meaningful, a recipe that had traveled from Ireland with Thomas's grandmother during the potato famine, adapted to New World ingredients but maintaining the warming spices and techniques of the original preparation. Thomas had loved the ritual of making it each November, carefully selecting the berries and measuring the spices while recounting stories of ancestors we knew only through these culinary traditions. I packaged each dish in my best serving pieces: pottery, bowls hand-thrown by a local artisan, the carved wooden serving spoons Thomas had made from maple trees on our property, the embroidered linens that had been my grandmother's wedding gift. These weren't just containers, but artifacts of our family's connection to place and tradition, physical embodiments of the values we had tried to instill in Jeffrey throughout his childhood. The drive to their home in Lakeside Estates took nearly 40 minutes, the exclusive community's location intentionally removed from the ordinary neighborhoods where people like me lived. The guard at the gate checked my name against an approved visitor list before reluctantly waving me through, his expression suggesting that my 15-year-old sedan was an unusual sight in this land of luxury vehicles. Jeffrey and Diane's home was a modernist structure of glass and steel perched on a manufactured hillside overlooking the community's private lake. Its clean lines and minimalist aesthetic represented everything my historic Victorian was not: contemporary, efficient, and devoid of the layers of history that made my own home feel so deeply rooted in place and time. The dissonance between my expectations and reality became apparent almost immediately upon arrival. My carefully prepared heritage dishes were quickly relegated to the kitchen counter, replaced by a catered spread that Diane described as modern Thanksgiving interpretations from a trendy downtown restaurant. The cranberry chutney that had taken hours to prepare, with hand-selected berries and Thomas's favorite warming spices, was emptied into a generic serving dish, the mason jar with my handwritten label discreetly placed in the recycling bin. "We thought we'd update the presentation a bit," Diane explained when she noticed my expression. "Those old containers are so rustic. This fits better with our tablescape." The dining table had been professionally decorated in a monochromatic scheme of white and silver that Diane explained was this season's Thanksgiving palette according to Modern Home. My colorful dishes looked jarringly out of place against the carefully curated aesthetic, their rich hues and homemade appearance disrupting the magazine-perfect arrangement. Their children, 12-year-old Madison and 15-year-old Tyler, barely acknowledged my arrival, engrossed in their phones until called repeatedly to the table. When Madison finally approached to offer a perfunctory hug, she wrinkled her nose at my homemade dishes. "What's that smell?" she asked, pointing to the corn. "Pudding." "It looks weird." "That's an old family recipe," I began, eager to share the story behind the dish. "Your great-great-grandmother brought it from—" "We've got the caterer's corn soufflé," Diane interrupted smoothly. "It's gluten-free and made with organic heirloom corn. I'm sure the kids will prefer that." As the meal progressed, I noticed increasingly pointed comments about updating traditions and moving beyond outdated approaches. When I mentioned the historical significance of certain dishes in our family's story, Jeffrey exchanged glances with Diane before changing the subject to their plans for purchasing the now-closed restaurant building next to my home. "It's the perfect location for the boutique condos we've been planning," he explained, pulling out architectural renderings that showed a modern complex where the historic building now stood. "We've already submitted initial permits based on the zoning, changes that should be approved next month." The renderings revealed a sleek 5-story building with ground-floor retail space for what Jeffrey described as upscale amenities: a wine bar, a boutique fitness studio, and a specialty food shop featuring imported delicacies. The condominiums would start at $750,000, a price point that effectively excluded most current neighborhood residents from even considering ownership. "We'll be breaking ground by spring," Jeffrey continued, his enthusiasm growing as he detailed the project's financial projections. "The return on investment looks exceptional, especially given what we're expecting to pay for the property now that the restaurant has finally failed completely." The casual dismissal of the restaurant's closure as mere business opportunity rather than community loss struck a painful chord. Failed seemed such an inadequate description for the gradual economic pressures that had made the historic gathering place financially unsustainable despite its continued social and cultural significance. When I expressed surprise and concern about the potential loss of a space that had meant so much to our community, the conversation took a turn I hadn't anticipated. As I described the restaurant's historical significance and its potential for revival as a community resource, Diane leaned toward Madison and whispered what she clearly thought was beyond my hearing. "She's just a leftover from another era. She doesn't understand how things work now." The sudden silence that followed suggested others had heard too, creating a moment of uncomfortable awareness that hung over the table. Jeffrey, perhaps attempting to move past the awkwardness, shifted to what he positioned as practical concern. "Mom, this is exactly why we've been suggesting that retirement community near the lake," he said, his tone blending condescension with forced patience. "You'd be with people your own age who share these nostalgic perspectives. The neighborhood is changing, and it's time to accept that some traditions just don't fit modern realities." Tyler, looking up briefly from his phone, added with teenage bluntness, "Yeah, Grandma, that old restaurant is super outdated. Nobody wants to eat that kind of food anymore. It's all about fusion and molecular gastronomy now." In that moment of painful clarity, as I sat surrounded by family members who viewed my lifetime of experience as irrelevant leftovers rather than valuable wisdom, something crystallized within me. The dismissal wasn't just personal rejection, but represented broader devaluation of elder knowledge, community connection, and cultural continuity that had anchored our town for generations. The comparison to leftovers, food remnants deemed less desirable than the original meal, kept out of obligation rather than appreciation, perfectly captured how they viewed not just me, but the entire community heritage I represented. Yet in our food traditions, leftovers were never diminished value but transformed potential, ingredients that skilled hands could recompose into dishes often more complex and nourishing than the original meal. Rather than creating a scene that would only reinforce their perception of me as emotionally fragile or stubbornly outdated, I simply nodded and asked thoughtful questions about their development plans. As they enthusiastically outlined their vision for luxury housing that would revitalize the neighborhood, I was already formulating an entirely different approach to preserving what truly mattered while demonstrating the continued relevance of principles they had dismissed as outdated leftovers from another time. That Thanksgiving evening, as I drove home alone with containers of my barely touched heritage dishes, now literally leftovers returning to my kitchen, I made a decision that would ultimately transform not just my circumstances, but our entire community's understanding of intergenerational wisdom and nourishment beyond mere sustenance. When I rose to speak at the emergency community meeting that cold December evening, few present knew about my personal circumstances or the luxury condominium plans threatening both my home and the historic Millfield restaurant. Rather than beginning with opposition to Jeffrey's proposal, I shared a vision for what the restaurant space could become with proper investment and renewed purpose, a comprehensive heritage table project connecting our town's culinary traditions with its future through expanded cooking education, food security initiatives, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and preservation of cultural food practices that had defined our community for generations. The value of this space isn't measured through potential luxury development, I explained, standing before the 43 neighbors gathered in the community center's meeting room. The restaurant itself having closed its doors the previous month after nearly 150 years of continuous operation. It's measured through the nourishment it creates, the traditions it preserves, and the community resilience it builds across generations. Sometimes investment returns should be calculated in human connection rather than property appreciation. As I spoke, I could see the change in expressions around the room, from resignation about the inevitable loss of their beloved gathering place to rekindled hope about what it might become instead. Several older residents nodded in recognition when I mentioned how the restaurant had hosted their wedding receptions or milestone birthday celebrations, while younger parents leaned forward as I described expanded after-school cooking programs that would address food education gaps in our community while providing essential afternoon care for working families. What we're facing isn't just a real estate decision about property, I continued, but a choice about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be a place where culinary heritage is erased for luxury housing that few current residents could afford? Or a place where different generations learn from each other and create food security through meaningful collaboration? When I concluded by presenting my formal purchase offer for the restaurant property, matching the commercial bid, but with binding provisions ensuring the property would remain dedicated to food education and community nourishment in perpetuity. The immediate response was spontaneous applause from longtime residents who had watched their children and grandchildren celebrate life milestones in that space over decades. What made my proposal different from previous attempts to save the struggling restaurant wasn't just funding, but vision, connecting the culinary heritage purpose with a sustainable operational model through partnerships with local institutions that would provide both resources and consistent programming. The county's vocational school would use the space for culinary arts training, bringing future chefs into direct community experience while providing staffed programs at minimal cost. The regional healthcare network would establish nutrition education programs addressing preventive care through community-based food literacy while creating intergenerational mentoring opportunities between nutrition specialists and older adults, preserving traditional cooking methods. I'm offering not just a purchase price that matches the commercial bid, I explained as the room quieted, but an implementation plan that transforms this space from a struggling restaurant into a vibrant food education hub with a sustainable funding model beyond constant fundraising efforts. The structure would preserve historical elements while updating functional spaces to serve contemporary food security needs across generations. The community board chair, Margaret Wheaton, who had been reluctantly leading the difficult discussions about selling the property, looked visibly relieved. We've been searching for a viable alternative that would preserve the restaurant's community purpose while addressing operational sustainability. This proposal seems to address both concerns through structured partnerships rather than just continued donation dependency. The vote was scheduled for the following week to allow proper consideration, but the energy shift in the room made clear which direction sentiment had turned. Several board members approached me afterward with offers to help refine the implementation plan, sharing expertise from their professional backgrounds in hospitality management, nutrition education, and food systems administration. As I walked home with Eleanor that evening, her legal expertise having proved invaluable in structuring my proposal, she observed something important about what had just occurred. You didn't just offer money to prevent development. You provided an alternative vision that spoke to what people truly value beyond market metrics. That's why they responded so powerfully. The following morning brought the inevitable confrontation with Jeffrey. I had expected him to contact me after hearing about the community meeting, but I was surprised when he appeared at my door rather than calling. His expression revealed the complex mixture of emotions beneath his developer persona: frustration at encountering unexpected resistance, calculation about potential workarounds, and genuine confusion about my involvement in countering his business plans. "Mom, what were you thinking?" he began without preamble as he stepped into my kitchen. "That restaurant property is the cornerstone of our entire development project. We've already invested significant capital in preliminary work based on the zoning changes." Rather than becoming defensive, I offered him coffee and one of the heritage cinnamon rolls I'd been baking when he arrived, a recipe from his great-grandmother that had been his favorite childhood breakfast. The familiar aroma momentarily disrupted his professional demeanor, creating brief connection to memories before he regained his business focus. "The community values that restaurant for reasons beyond its real estate potential," I explained calmly. "It represents cultural heritage, shared history, and gathering space that luxury condominiums simply cannot replace, regardless of how well-designed they might be." Jeffrey's response revealed the fundamental disconnect in our perspectives. "Mom, I understand you have emotional attachment to these old buildings and recipes, but practical reality requires realistic assessment of what's sustainable. That restaurant has been failing financially for years. My development creates housing that addresses contemporary needs while significantly increasing the tax base. This characterization, reducing vibrant community resource to emotional attachment while framing luxury development as practical necessity, highlighted exactly why intervention had become essential. Jeffrey wasn't simply making a business decision. He was imposing a value system that privileged financial metrics over human connection, market calculations over community continuity. The restaurant served over 400 families last year through various programs, despite its financial struggles, I corrected gently. That's not emotional attachment, but significant community impact. And sustainability comes in different forms beyond commercial profit. Creating connected community where people know their neighbors, where children learn nutritional literacy, where seniors maintain purpose through sharing knowledge across generations. As our conversation continued without resolution, Jeffrey eventually shifted to what he clearly considered his strongest argument. This development would create significant financial security for your future and substantial inheritance potential. For Madison and Tyler, the property values we're talking about represent a major portion of your assets that could be generating much better returns through proper development. What he failed to understand, despite a lifetime of shared meals and family traditions, was that I had never measured security or legacy primarily through financial assets or investment returns. My career in food education had always focused on different metrics: cultural knowledge preserved, community connections strengthened, food security created for those with limited resources to access nourishing meals. I appreciate your concern for my financial security, I acknowledge sincerely. But my teacher's pension provides adequately for my needs. And legacy isn't measured solely through assets transferred to future generations, but through values demonstrated and community impact created. Your children may ultimately inherit less property value, but more meaningful understanding of what creates thriving communities beyond luxury housing. When Jeffrey left without resolution, his expression, reflecting genuine bewilderment rather than simple frustration, I recognized the depth of our divergent perspectives. Despite being raised with homemade meals that connected him to his heritage and community gatherings that demonstrated shared abundance, he truly couldn't comprehend prioritizing cultural continuity over property appreciation or measuring security through relationships rather than financial assets. The week between the community meeting and the scheduled vote transformed my understanding of what was truly at stake. What had begun as defensive response to personal dismissal and community loss evolved into catalyst for neighborhood connection that transcended the immediate property question. Residents who had never attended community meetings appeared at impromptu planning sessions hosted in living rooms throughout the area. Teenagers offered suggestions for culinary programs that would actually engage their peers rather than adult assumptions about what youth needed. Seniors shared handwritten recipe cards and cooking techniques that could inform heritage preservation, aspects of the revitalized center. Most remarkably, the planning process naturally evolved to address broader food security challenges within our changing community. As real estate prices had risen throughout the region, many working families struggled with basic food access, creating fragility in our local food system that luxury development would only exacerbate. Discussions about preserving culinary heritage naturally expanded to include community gardens, cooking education focused on nutritious affordable meals, and distribution networks ensuring food reached those most vulnerable to insecurity. Meanwhile, Jeffrey moved aggressively to secure his development plans before the community vote could potentially derail them. Through business connections, he arranged private meeting with key county commissioners to discuss expedited approval for zoning variances his project would require. He hired architectural firm to create enhanced renderings emphasizing community benefits through retail spaces that would technically be public access, though financially inaccessible to most current residents. Most concerning, he began quiet campaigns suggesting my alternative proposal reflected cognitive decline rather than legitimate business alternative, using my age as weapon against my credibility. Several community members reported conversations where Jeffrey had expressed concern about my ability to manage complex projects at my age, suggesting my vision represented well-intentioned but unrealistic nostalgia rather than viable operational plan. This approach, using my age to dismiss my capacity despite 5 decades of professional experience in food systems and education, reflected exactly the ageist devaluation his leftover comment had revealed at Thanksgiving. Rather than engaging with the substance of my proposal, he attempted to undermine its consideration by suggesting the very experience that informed it somehow disqualified me from contemporary relevance. Eleanor's legal expertise proved invaluable in this challenging period. Her decades of elder law practice had made her particularly attuned to how aging is weaponized against older adults' autonomy and voice in community decisions. She helped structure our response, emphasizing the intergenerational nature of the Yao Heritage Table proposal, with leadership roles distributed across age demographics while preserving elder wisdom as valued resource rather than antiquated limitation. This isn't about any individual's capacity, but about community wisdom across generations, she advised. Frame the project as collective legacy building rather than personal project, with appropriate operational structures ensuring sustainability, regardless of any particular individual's continued involvement. When the community board gathered for their scheduled vote the following week, the meeting had to be moved from the small conference room to the main hall of the community center because attendance exceeded capacity. Families brought children and grandparents, creating multi-generational presence that physically demonstrated the community nature of what was at stake beyond abstract property considerations. Jeffrey arrived with small contingent of business, associates and the architectural firm's presentation team, their formal attire and presentation materials, creating visible contrast with the community members in everyday clothes, sharing home-baked cookies and thermos coffee. His team had prepared sophisticated economic impact presentation emphasizing property tax benefits and temporary construction jobs, with carefully selected visuals showing diverse models enjoying the proposed luxury amenities. The board chair seemed momentarily overwhelmed by the unprecedented turnout, before adapting the format to accommodate broader participation. Rather than formal presentation of competing proposals, she invited community dialogue about what the restaurant represented to different generations and what its future might become through collaborative reimagining. Longtime residents shared stories about significant life moments celebrated within those historic walls, wedding rehearsal dinners spanning 3 generations, homecoming meals that welcomed young people back to the community after college or military service, funeral luncheons that had provided comfort during the hardest of times. Parents described how the restaurant's community programs had provided their children first experiences with food beyond packaged convenience items, introducing vegetables and cooking techniques that expanded limited food horizons. Most powerfully, several recent immigrants spoke about how the restaurant's international dinner series had provided rare opportunity to share their culinary heritage with the broader community, creating connection points across cultural differences through the universal language of shared meals. A Vietnamese family described how the spring roll workshop had created unexpected friendships with elderly residents, who recognized parallels with their own traditional food preservation techniques, despite vastly different culinary traditions. When Jeffrey finally spoke, visibly uncomfortable addressing community gathering rather than board presentation, his carefully prepared economic arguments seemed strangely disconnected from the lived experiences surrounding him. His projections about increased tax base and property value appreciation fell flat against stories about children learning ancestral cooking techniques, seniors finding purpose through teaching traditional recipes, and families connecting across cultural differences through shared meals and preserved food traditions. While these stories are certainly touching, he concluded with forced professional smile, the economic realities remain unchanged. Sentimentality cannot sustain operations that fundamental market metrics have already proven unsustainable. Our development provides practical solution with tangible community benefits through modern amenities and improved property values for surrounding homes. The board chair thanked him for his presentation before inviting me to share the concrete implementation plan for the Heritage Table proposal. Rather than countering Jeffrey's market arguments directly, I focused on the integrated operational model that addressed the legitimate sustainability concerns while preserving the cultural and community values reflected in the stories shared. The Heritage Table isn't about sentimentality, but about practical preservation of community assets that market metrics alone cannot measure, I began, acknowledging the real challenges that had made the traditional restaurant unsustainable. Our proposal directly addresses operational sustainability through institutional partnerships, providing staff resources, program funding, and consistent utilization beyond what individual patronage alone could support. The presentation outlined specific operational elements, culinary arts training program through the vocational school, providing both staffing and program revenue. Healthcare Network's Nutrition Education Initiative bringing prevention-focused funding streams. Workforce development grants supporting food service job training for underemployed community members. And Commercial Kitchen Incubator, creating small business opportunities for local food entrepreneurs currently lacking access to licensed production facilities. This isn't rejection of economic reality, but expansion of how we measure value beyond single-dimensional market metrics, I continued, displaying projected operational budgets alongside community impact assessments. The Heritage Table creates sustainable operation through diversified revenue streams while preserving irreplaceable community and cultural assets that luxury housing would permanently eliminate. The formal vote, when finally conducted, was anticlimactic, given the clear community sentiment. The board unanimously approved my purchase offer with its perpetual community food education provisions, spontaneous applause confirming widespread support for preserving community resource rather than converting it to luxury housing. As meeting concluded, I found myself surrounded by neighbors offering implementation help, from retired contractors volunteering renovation expertise to nutritionists, proposing specific program elements addressing food insecurity they observed through their clinical practice. What had begun as individual response to personal dismissal had evolved into community movement, reimagining shared space through collective vision and collaborative action. Jeffrey departed immediately after the vote without conversation, his expression revealing mixture of professional frustration and personal confusion about outcome that contradicted his market-based expectations. While I felt profound sadness about our relationship's strain, clarity about community values provided counterbalance to personal disappointment. The following morning brought unexpected email from Diane, who had remained noticeably absent throughout the community meetings and voting process. Her message offered perspective I hadn't considered. Jeffrey genuinely believes his development approach represents progress and practical improvement over what he sees as outdated, inefficient traditions and spaces. He struggles to understand why others don't recognize the benefits he sees so clearly through his professional lens. This framing, Jeffrey's actions reflecting sincerely held perspective rather than simply callous disregard, provided important reminder about assuming negative intentions rather than recognizing genuine differences in values and priorities. While his approach threatened community resources I considered essential, his perspective arose from professional education and experience that truly measured progress through different metrics than those guiding my career in food education and community nourishment. This recognition didn't change necessary opposition to his development plans, but shifted my understanding of our fundamental disconnect. The conversation wasn't simply about right versus wrong decisions, but about profoundly different value systems measuring progress and success through incompatible frameworks. As I began coordinating renovation planning for the newly secured restaurant building, this awareness informed my approach to potential healing in family relationships. Rather than positioning our differences as moral failing or character flaw, I could recognize genuine perspective difference requiring bridge building rather than conversion or defeat. The renovation process began with community assessment documenting both physical structure and intangible heritage elements requiring preservation. The building's historical elements, the massive hearth, hand-hewn ceiling beams, original stone walls, would be carefully preserved, while kitchen facilities underwent significant modernization to accommodate diverse programming needs and current health regulations. Most importantly, the renovation integrated practical elements addressing both financial sustainability and cultural preservation. The main dining room would serve multiple functions: community cafe during daytime hours, teaching space for cooking classes during scheduled programs, and rental venue for community celebrations generating revenue supporting core operations. The professional kitchen would meet commercial licensing requirements for food business incubation, while accommodating teaching stations for educational programs. The garden space connecting my home to the restaurant property became symbolic transition zone representing integration rather than separation. The existing heritage plants, heirloom herbs, berry bushes, and fruit trees planted decades earlier, would be preserved and expanded into production garden, supporting both educational programs and community cafe operations. Rather than fence, line dividing properties, permeable pathways created natural flow between spaces while maintaining appropriate boundaries. 3 weeks into the renovation planning, unexpected opportunity emerged through Challenge Jeffrey's development company, filed with zoning board. His legal team argued that my proposed educational use represented change requiring special variance under existing commercial restaurant zoning. Technical objection that might potentially delay implementation despite community board approval. This apparent obstacle created opening for something more significant: comprehensive regulatory framework establishing community food heritage designation, with specific provisions protecting cultural food spaces while allowing appropriate redevelopment, aligned with community food security priorities. Rather than simply defending individual property, we could create structural framework preserving culinary heritage and food access throughout the region through formal policy protections. Working with food policy specialist from State University, Community Committee developed proposal designating certain properties, including the historic restaurant and surrounding food production spaces, as community nourishment zones with specific protection from luxury conversion. The framework didn't prevent development but required any changes demonstrate clear community food security benefit beyond market metrics, with formal resident participation in approval processes. When presented to County Planning Commission, this approach received unexpected support from members concerned about similar community food resource losses throughout metropolitan area. What had begun as defensive response to specific development threat evolved into potential model for food heritage preservation balancing appropriate growth with community nourishment protection. 6 weeks after the community board vote, with formal closing completed on restaurant purchase and renovation planning advancing through collaborative design process, I received unexpected message from Jeffrey requesting meeting to discuss future relationship parameters given recent developments. The formal language revealed continued emotional distance but suggested openness to establishing new framework beyond current impasse. We met at neutral location, coffee shop downtown rather than either my home or his office, avoiding spaces, carrying emotional significance for either of us. His initial demeanor maintained professional reserve, as though approaching business negotiation rather than family reconciliation. My development company is focusing on different location with more receptive environment for luxury residential projects, he began, establishing business consequences before addressing personal implications. While I maintain that my proposal represented practical improvement and economic benefit, continued pursuit of this particular location doesn't represent efficient use of resources given community opposition. This framing, development decision, based on practical considerations rather than acknowledging community values or relationship repair, maintained his perspective while creating opening for potential conversation beyond property dispute. Rather than challenging his characterization, I accepted this starting point for dialogue that might eventually bridge our fundamental differences. "I appreciate your willingness to meet," I responded, focusing on relationship rather than property outcome. While we clearly see community development through different frameworks, finding way forward in our family relationship matters independently from business decisions or property questions. Jeffrey's expression revealed momentary vulnerability beneath professional persona, suggestion that personal relationship held value separate from property resolution despite his actions indicating otherwise. "Diane thinks we should establish regular family dinners regardless of professional disagreements," he offered, revealing his wife's behind-the-scenes efforts toward reconciliation. "The children miss their regular visits with you." This opening, connection, through his children rather than direct relationship repair, provided pathway worth pursuing despite continuing tension. My grandchildren had always represented bridge between our different value systems, their natural curiosity about cooking, traditions creating connection points otherwise difficult to establish with their parents. "I would welcome that," I agreed sincerely. "The children shouldn't bear consequences of adult disagreements or different perspectives on community development. Perhaps we could start with Sunday dinner at my home. Their home too, with foods and memories worth preserving regardless of property development perspectives." Jeffrey's slight relaxation revealed meaningful step despite continuing distance. "Diane suggested something similar," he acknowledged. 5 o'clock Sunday would work with the children's activities. As our conversation concluded without dramatic reconciliation, but with practical next steps toward relationship repair, Jeffrey hesitated before adding unexpected comment. "The Heritage Designation Framework has received substantial policy attention, emphasizing food security innovation rather than just property preservation. The integrated implementation model has attracted attention beyond local application." This observation, recognizing broader significance beyond our specific conflict, suggested potential shift in his understanding, however limited. While he might not embrace community values replacing market metrics in his development approach, he could at least recognize legitimate alternative to his professional framework, with meaningful impact beyond what he had dismissed as sentimental attachment to outdated traditions. As I walked home afterward, the conversation's limited progress provided perspective on relationship healing requiring patience rather than immediate resolution. Our fundamental value differences remained unchanged, Jeffrey continuing to prioritize financial calculations and market efficiency, while I measured success through community connection and cultural continuity. Yet finding practical coexistence, despite these differences, represented necessary first step toward potential deeper understanding. The Heritage Table renovation began the following week, with volunteer teams handling initial preparation while professional contractors managed structural issues requiring specialized expertise. The collaborative process embodied exactly the community-building purpose the center would serve, people contributing different skills toward shared vision that transcended individual interests or market considerations. What had begun as devastating personal dismissal, being callously labeled a leftover from another era during family Thanksgiving, had transformed into catalyst for community preservation and development model, potentially benefiting neighborhoods beyond our own. Sometimes painful circumstances reveal essentials otherwise obscured by comfortable routines, creating clarity about what truly matters and opportunity to demonstrate values through concrete action rather than theoretical principles. The comment that had wounded me at Thanksgiving, dismissing me as mere leftover from irrelevant era, had intended to diminish my voice and devalue my perspective based solely on age rather than substance. The response it ultimately triggered created something far more significant than personal vindication or hurt feelings. Community preservation framework potentially protecting food heritage throughout the region while demonstrating development. Model measuring success through human nourishment rather than market metrics alone. 1 year later, the Heritage Table celebrated its first anniversary on a perfect autumn afternoon, the renovated restaurant's doors thrown open to welcome hundreds of community members to the harvest celebration. What had once been a struggling establishment facing demolition for luxury condominiums had transformed into a vibrant intergenerational hub that served as both culinary education center and community anchor for our town. Standing in the doorway of the historic Fieldstone building, now fully accessible through thoughtfully designed ramps that complemented the structure's rustic character, I watched families stream into the celebration with a sense of wonder at how profoundly things had changed in just 12 months. Children raced toward the teaching kitchen where cooking classes had introduced them to foods beyond processed convenience items. Teenagers guided seniors through the digital recipe archive where reverse mentoring programs had created unexpected connections across generations. Young parents chatted with retired cooks who provided nutritional support that had measurably improved food security throughout the neighborhood. When you presented this vision a year ago, I honestly wasn't sure it could work, admitted Margaret Wheaton, who had chaired the community board during the pivotal vote that saved the restaurant from redevelopment. The operational challenges seemed overwhelming even if we could secure the property. Yet here we are with more programs, more participants, and sustainable funding model unlike anything we imagined possible. This transformation hadn't happened through single dramatic solution, but through integrated approach combining institutional partnerships, community participation, and operational structure that balanced culinary heritage mission with practical sustainability. The renovated facility physically embodied this balanced approach, preserving historical elements that connected to community food traditions while incorporating contemporary design, supporting diverse educational functions and efficient operations. The main dining room, where generations of families had celebrated milestones and community gatherings had marked seasonal transitions, retained its soaring ceiling and original stone walls while gaining energy-efficient lighting and acoustic treatments that made the space suitable for everything from cooking demonstrations to community celebrations. The former private dining rooms had been reconfigured into flexible learning spaces where culinary students conducted supervised teaching programs with community members, providing reliable program staffing while giving future chefs invaluable, practical experience beyond conventional restaurant training. Most significantly, the renovation had transformed the building's underutilized storage areas into state-of-the-art community kitchen, where 3 distinct but interconnected programs operated simultaneously. Food business incubators supporting local entrepreneurs developing small-scale commercial products, community meal preparation addressing food insecurity through dignified access to nutritious options, and heritage cooking documentation preserving traditional recipes and techniques through professionally recorded demonstrations by community elders. The model you've developed here is attracting attention well beyond this town, noted Dr. James Chen, Director of Culinary Arts at the County Vocational School and key institutional partner in the Heritage Table. The integration of professional training with community food security addresses multiple challenges simultaneously, giving our students authentic teaching experience while providing consistent, quality programming for community members across generations. What had begun as defensive response to personal dismissal and community threat had evolved into innovative culinary education model with potential applications far beyond our specific circumstances. The Heritage Table demonstrated approach to community food security that balanced institutional resources with neighborhood needs, professional expertise with cultural wisdom, and historical preservation with contemporary function. The central teaching kitchen exemplified this integration. The massive hearth that had heated the original stagecoach stop remained functional centerpiece demonstrating historical cooking methods, while surrounding it, modern cooking stations provided contemporary equipment ensuring students learned both traditional techniques and current professional standards. Display screens allowed detailed viewing of techniques being demonstrated while raising tables accommodated participants with mobility differences, ensuring accessibility across physical capabilities and learning styles. The garden connecting. My home with the heritage table had blossomed into productive demonstration space where heirloom varieties thrived alongside innovative vertical growing systems. Traditional raised beds containing herbs documented in community recipes for generations grew beside aquaponic systems demonstrating water-conserving production methods addressing contemporary sustainability challenges. The garden served multiple functions, supplying ingredients for cooking programs, demonstrating sustainable growing techniques, preserving heritage varieties through seed-saving programs, and providing therapeutic green space where stress reduction complemented nutritional education. As the anniversary celebration continued around me, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable journey from that shocking Thanksgiving evening when Diane had whispered, "She's just a leftover from another era," and Jeffrey had suggested I belonged in age-segregated facility rather than vibrant intergenerational community. The dismissal had been profound. Not just personal rejection, but fundamental devaluation of elder wisdom and cultural continuity that defined community beyond market transactions. Yet this painful experience had ultimately revealed clarity and purpose that might otherwise have remained dormant beneath comfortable routines and good intentions. The threatened loss of both personal dignity and community heritage had crystallized understanding about what truly mattered. Not property appreciation or market value, but cultural wisdom and shared purpose that created community identity beyond commercial development metrics. Most surprisingly, this clarity had created unexpected bridge with Jeffrey that our previous comfortable disagreements had never achieved. While our fundamental value systems remained distinct, his continuing to prioritize financial efficiency and market considerations, while mine emphasized community connection and cultural preservation, the concrete manifestation of these different approaches had created space for mutual recognition that abstract discussions never accomplished. As though summoned by these reflections, Jeffrey appeared at the celebration with Diane and their children, their arrival marking significant evolution from our relationship's lowest point a year earlier. While the initial Sunday dinners following our coffee shop meeting had been awkward affairs balanced precariously between politeness and genuine connection, gradual engagement had emerged through the children's enthusiastic participation in heritage table programs. 15-year-old Tyler had discovered unexpected passion for culinary arts through the center's Teen Chef program, developing knife skills and flavor understanding that connected him to professional possibilities he'd never previously considered. 12-year-old Madison had found creative outlet through the food photography workshop, where documentation of traditional dishes created stunning visual archive of community culinary heritage. Their genuine enthusiasm had created opening Jeffrey couldn't easily dismiss, despite his continuing skepticism about the center's operational model. "Dad, come see what we finished," Madison called, pulling Jeffrey toward the heritage documentation area where the digital recipe archive was featured prominently in the anniversary celebration. They installed our food photography exhibition with interactive recipe database showing culinary evolution across 8 cultural traditions. You can literally see how recipes adapted while maintaining core techniques and flavor profiles across generations. Jeffrey allowed himself to be guided through the exhibition, his developer's analytical perspective gradually engaging with the material beyond initial polite interest. The project presented culinary evolution through multiple lenses simultaneously: historical photographs and handwritten recipes showing traditional practices, oral history recordings describing lived experience during different periods, and contemporary adaptations demonstrating continued relevance of heritage techniques to modern dietary needs. "This is remarkably comprehensive cultural documentation," he acknowledged, professional assessment momentarily overriding personal distance. The integration of qualitative tradition with quantitative nutritional analysis provides unusually nuanced understanding of food system evolution across generations. That's exactly what food anthropologists from the university said, Madison reported proudly. They're incorporating our documentation methodology into graduate program curriculum because it captures cultural adaptation patterns usually missing from conventional culinary analysis. This recognition, academic validation of approach Jeffrey could respect professionally despite emerging from value system he didn't personally share, created unexpected connection point bridging our fundamental differences. While he might never fully embrace community-centered metrics replacing market considerations, he could acknowledge legitimate alternative framework producing outcomes valuable even within his professional perspective. As Jeffrey explored the exhibition with genuine interest rather than mere politeness, I observed similar evolution occurring throughout the heritage table that day. Residents who had initially divided along generational or socioeconomic lines during development debates found connection points through shared participation in center programs. Seniors who had opposed certain renovation elements as unnecessary, modernization now enthusiastically demonstrated traditional techniques using contemporary equipment that accommodated their physical limitations. Young professionals who had supported Jeffrey's luxury housing for potential property value enhancement now volunteered as program mentors recognizing community benefits beyond market metrics. Your vision for this place has actually created something neither side anticipated during last year's conflict, observed Eleanor, who had joined me watching this community tapestry unfold before us. It's not just preserved building or defeated development proposal, but demonstrated entirely different approach to community vitality, measuring success through cultural continuity and shared nourishment rather than commercial metrics. This perspective, seeing beyond binary opposition toward transformative alternative, captured something essential about the heritage table's significance beyond specific programs or services. The center had become physical embodiment of value system, measuring community health through culinary education, intergenerational connection, and shared purpose rather than property appreciation or commercial development. The anniversary celebration continued into evening, transitioning from daytime family activities to community harvest dinner, where residents shared dishes reflecting town's diverse cultural heritage. As twilight settled over the gathering, informal program emerged where community members offered reflections on the center's significance in their lives across generations. Mr. Abernathy, at 91, the town's oldest resident, described learning to make cornbread on the restaurant's hearth during the Great Depression when his mother worked as assistant cook. Recent immigrant parents expressed gratitude for cooking classes helping their children maintain cultural connections while adapting to local ingredients and techniques. Teenagers credited culinary training with developing skills leading to first employment opportunities beyond typical service jobs previously available. When Margaret invited me to share my perspective as the catalyst behind the center's transformation, I found myself reflecting on a journey far more complex than simple property preservation or program development. What we're celebrating today isn't just buildings saved from demolition or programs created through institutional partnerships, I began, looking across faces representing communities' full diversity. We're recognizing communities' capacity to define itself through shared cultural wisdom and connections transcending market metrics or commercial development pressures that increasingly shape our towns. As I continued, the themes that had crystallized through this challenging year emerged with clarity I hadn't fully articulated even to myself until this moment. When I was dismissed as just a leftover from another era at that painful Thanksgiving dinner, I experienced lesson about cultural devaluation that many communities face on larger scale through development pressures and economic displacement. The parallel between personal experience and broader community challenges created unexpected connection with residents who had faced similar pressures through rising property values, changing neighborhood demographics, and development redefining community character without resident participation. My individual story had embodied collective experience often difficult to articulate through conventional planning discussions or development debates. What emerged through our shared response wasn't just preservation of particular building, but demonstration that community defines itself through connections and purpose beyond property ownership or market value, I continued. The heritage table represents alternative development approach measuring community health through cultural continuity, nutritional well-being, and intergenerational connection rather than commercial metrics alone. As my remarks concluded, the spontaneous standing ovation reflected recognition beyond personal appreciation, community acknowledging shared accomplishment, creating alternative to development patterns that increasingly threaten town identity throughout our region. The heritage table wasn't just successful program center, but tangible demonstration that different metrics could guide community development when residents claimed active role-defining neighborhood character beyond market forces. Later that evening, as celebration transitioned to cleanup involving volunteers across generations working together with remarkable efficiency, born from genuine community ownership, Jeffrey approached with uncharacteristic hesitation suggesting conversation beyond polite family reconciliation. The documentation project Madison's involved with presents compelling case for integrated development approach I hadn't previously considered, he began, professional assessment providing safer entry point than personal. Acknowledgement. The correlation between cultural preservation and community stability metrics suggests different development framework worth exploring from market perspective. This framing, potential market validation for community-centered approach, represented significant evolution from dismissing preservation efforts as merely sentimental attachment to outdated traditions. While Jeffrey might never fully embrace value system prioritizing community connection over commercial efficiency, he could now recognize legitimate alternative development framework with measurable outcomes beyond emotional satisfaction. The heritage table represents one model integrating cultural preservation with contemporary function, I acknowledged, accepting this limited bridge across our fundamental differences. Different communities might require different specific applications, but the underlying principle remains consistent. Development measuring success through cultural continuity and shared purpose alongside financial metrics. Jeffrey nodded, his analytical mind visibly processing implications beyond our specific situation. The county planning department has approached my company about potential mixed-use project incorporating community food space using partnership structure similar to your model here. I'd appreciate your perspective on essential elements that make this approach functional beyond good intentions. This request, professional consultation acknowledging expertise beyond sentimental advocacy, represented perhaps the most meaningful reconciliation possible given our fundamentally different value systems. While Jeffrey might never prioritize community connection over market efficiency in his development approach, he could now recognize legitimate alternative worth incorporating into professional framework rather than dismissing as impractical idealism. Our conversation continued with surprisingly productive exchange about specific structural elements making the heritage table sustainable beyond volunteer enthusiasm or grant funding cycles. The institutional partnerships providing reliable staffing, through educational practicums, healthcare network engagement addressing nutritional literacy while developing preventive care metrics, and workforce development programming offering job training through community kitchen operations, all represented replicable model, potentially applicable across diverse development contexts. I'm not suggesting luxury development doesn't have place in overall housing ecosystem, I concluded as our conversation wound down. But community-centered spaces serving essential cultural and nutritional functions shouldn't be casually sacrificed for development serving narrow demographic while displacing existing community networks. Jeffrey's thoughtful nod represented significant shift from previous dismissal of preservation efforts. There's potential middle path between preservation purists and market absolutist developers, he acknowledged. The data from this first year suggests measurable benefits worth incorporating into balanced development framework beyond what either approach achieves in isolation. As evening concluded with community members dispersing after transforming the celebration space back to functional programming configuration with remarkable efficiency, I found myself reflecting on journey far more complex than simple property dispute or preservation victory. The dismissal as leftover that had wounded me at Thanksgiving had triggered response creating something none of us had initially imagined. Demonstration that community development could measure success through metrics beyond market value while creating sustainable model replicable beyond our specific circumstances. The months following our anniversary celebration brought unexpected developments, further validating the heritage table model beyond our town context. Regional food policy researchers from the university incorporated our approach into case study curriculum examining alternative metrics for community food system success. County Health Department provided implementation grants supporting similar centers in 3 additional neighborhoods facing development pressures threatening community food spaces. Most surprisingly, Jeffrey's development company established dedicated division focused on mixed-use projects incorporating community food education spaces using partnership structure modeled after our approach. While these external validations provided gratifying confirmation about the model's broader applicability, the most meaningful outcomes remained intensely local, measured through daily interactions and incremental transformations occurring within our community's social fabric. The seniors who had initially participated in heritage documentation primarily for cultural preservation now mentored immigrant families navigating unfamiliar food systems through newly shared cooking vocabulary. Teenagers who had found initial employment through culinary skills. Development returned as program volunteers, supporting younger participants following similar paths. Residents previously disconnected through generational or cultural differences found connection points through shared meals addressing common nutritional needs beyond demographic categories. The Heritage Table's physical transformation reflected this evolving community integration. The renovated dining space served multiple functions, adapting to changing needs throughout day and week. Morning coffee gathering for seniors combating isolation, after-school cooking classes providing supervised activities for working families, evening community meals creating affordable dining options while building cross-cultural connections, weekend market featuring products from incubator businesses emerging from entrepreneurship programs. 6 months after our anniversary celebration, the Heritage Table hosted regional symposium examining community-centered food development approaches that balanced preservation with contemporary function, resident wisdom with institutional resources, and cultural heritage with necessary adaptation. Representatives from municipalities across the region gathered to examine our model's potential application within diverse contexts, facing similar challenges, balancing development pressures with community food security. During panel discussion, exploring essential elements making community-centered development sustainable beyond volunteer enthusiasm or grant funding cycles, I found myself seated beside Jeffrey, our different perspectives now viewed as complementary expertise rather than oppositional positions. His analysis of financial structures supporting community food spaces provided practical implementation framework balancing mission-driven operations with necessary sustainability metrics. My emphasis on institutional partnerships creating mutual benefit beyond philanthropic contribution demonstrated engagement model maintaining operational stability while advancing each partner's core objectives. As we presented these integrated perspectives, the audience response reflected recognition that false dichotomy between market-driven development and community preservation limited potential solutions addressing contemporary challenges. The Heritage Table demonstrated alternative approach, integrating multiple value systems rather than privileging either commercial metrics or preservation priorities exclusively. What makes this model particularly compelling from implementation perspective is the integration of diverse measurement frameworks beyond conventional development metrics. Jeffrey noted during our presentation, his professional vocabulary now incorporating concepts previously outside his market-focused approach. The documented correlation between community food infrastructure and neighborhood stability suggests different development approach worth exploring from market perspective while advancing social objectives beyond commercial considerations. This evolution integrating community value metrics within market-oriented framework rather than treating them as inherently oppositional, represented perhaps the most significant transformation emerging from our painful conflict. While Jeffrey continued prioritizing financial efficiency and market considerations in his professional approach, he now recognized legitimate alternative measurement systems worth incorporating rather than dismissing as impractical idealism or sentimental attachment. One evening following community workshop, where Jeffrey had presented innovative financing models supporting food education spaces within mixed-use developments, we found ourselves discussing this evolution while watching Madison and Tyler enthusiastically participate in intergenerational cooking project pairing, youth with seniors creating heritage recipes adapted for contemporary nutritional needs. I still believe efficient resource allocation represents essential development principle, Jeffrey acknowledged, his fundamental values unchanged despite expanding perspective. But watching how this place functions has demonstrated different efficiency framework, measuring outcomes through cultural preservation and community nourishment alongside financial metrics. These aren't opposing considerations, but complementary measurement systems capturing more complete understanding of development impact. This insight, recognizing multiple valid frameworks measuring development success rather than privileging financial metrics exclusively, represented meaningful bridge across values gap that had previously seemed unbridgeable. While our fundamental perspectives remained distinct, mutual recognition had replaced dismissive opposition, creating space for collaborative approach, incorporating diverse measurement systems within integrated development framework. As the Heritage Table approached its second anniversary, County Planning Commission incorporated our model into policy recommendations addressing community food spaces throughout the metropolitan area. The Cultural Food Heritage designation created formal recognition for neighborhood culinary centers, providing both regulatory protection and implementation support for spaces demonstrating integrated approach similar to our Heritage Table model. When local newspaper featured extensive profile examining the center's impact beyond specific programs or services, the reporter captured something essential about its significance within contemporary development context. The Heritage Table represents more than successful community center or preservation victory. It demonstrates alternative development approach, measuring community vitality through culinary education, intergenerational connection, and cultural continuity alongside conventional market metrics that typically dominate planning decisions. Reading. This assessment, I reflected on remarkable journey from that painful Thanksgiving when I'd been casually dismissed as leftover from another era, unworthy of voice in contemporary conversations about community development. The dismissal had been profound, not just personal rejection, but fundamental devaluation of elder wisdom and cultural knowledge, defining community beyond mere real estate considerations. Yet this painful experience had ultimately revealed clarity and purpose that might otherwise have remained dormant beneath comfortable routines and good intentions. The threatened loss of both personal dignity and community heritage had crystallized understanding about what truly mattered, not property, ownership, or market value, but cultural wisdom and shared purpose creating community identity beyond commercial development metrics. Most remarkably, this clarity had eventually created unexpected bridge with Jeffrey that our previous comfortable disagreements had never achieved. While our fundamental value systems remained distinct, the concrete manifestation of different approaches had created space for mutual recognition that abstract discussions never accomplished. Our relationship would always contain tension between differing perspectives, but these differences now represented complementary expertise rather than oppositional positions. The Sunday family dinners had gradually evolved from awkward obligation to genuine, if sometimes challenging, engagement. While Jeffrey and Diane maintained their preference for contemporary approaches, and Madison and Tyler still spent most meals glued to their phones, moments of meaningful connection emerged through food traditions that transcended generational differences. Tyler's growing culinary skills created surprising bridge when he requested lessons in traditional techniques he could adapt for modern presentation in his culinary arts program. Madison's food photography documentation became family project as she recorded holiday meal preparations capturing both traditional elements and contemporary adaptations. As I watched grandchildren enthusiastically engaging with programs in space, that might have become luxury condominiums without intervention protecting community resources. The journey's significance extended far beyond personal vindication or property victory. The dismissal as leftover had triggered response-creating demonstration that community development could measure success through metrics beyond market value, while establishing model applicable far beyond our specific circumstances. Sometimes, painful dismissal reveals clarity about what truly matters, creating opportunity for purpose beyond what might otherwise have remained comfortable but unfulfilled intentions. Legacy isn't measured through property ownership or market value, but through values demonstrated and community impact created through purposeful action, aligned with deeper principles transcending individual circumstances. When I heard myself casually dismissed as leftover from another era at that Thanksgiving table, I could never have anticipated how that shocking moment would ultimately lead to community transformation far more meaningful than mere personal vindication. The Heritage Table now stands as living testimony to possibility of creating meaning from dismissal, purpose from disappointment, and community benefit from what might otherwise have been merely private property dispute measuring value solely through market metrics. 5 years later, "Grandma Martha, they need you for the ribbon cutting," Madison called, now 17 and remarkably poised as she coordinated the day's events with clipboard efficiency that reminded me of her father's organizational precision, though redirected toward community purpose rather than commercial development. Made my way toward the front entrance of the expanded Heritage Table, marveling at how what had begun as desperate response to personal dismissal had evolved into community transformation, extending far beyond our initial vision. The original restaurant building remained the heart of the complex, its historic character preserved while interior spaces continued evolving to serve contemporary educational needs. But now it anchored something more comprehensive: a community food campus incorporating adjacent properties into integrated learning environment, serving thousands of residents annually, while modeling development approach replicated throughout our region. "Can you believe this all started with being called a leftover at Thanksgiving?" Eleanor whispered as she joined me for the ceremony. Our friendship deepened through 5 years of collaboration, building something neither of us had initially imagined possible. At 78, I still found it remarkable how profoundly life could pivot through circumstances that initially appeared solely as painful rejection rather than opportunity for meaningful creation. The ribbon-cutting ceremony would officially open the newest addition to our food campus, the Culinary Heritage Center, housing expanded preservation programs, multimedia documentation studio, and food entrepreneurship facilities serving both educational and economic development purposes. The building occupied land previously containing abandoned commercial property that had deteriorated while ownership disputes prevented either redevelopment or restoration, its transformation representing another example of integrating cultural preservation with contemporary function through community-centered approach. What made this particular expansion especially meaningful wasn't just programmatic growth, but the partnership framework that had created it. Collaboration, including Jeffrey's development company alongside community organizations, educational institutions, and public agencies. The financing structure represented innovative blend of market mechanisms, philanthropic investment, and public resources demonstrating economically sustainable approach to community development beyond traditional either-or frameworks, separating commercial interests from neighborhood priorities. This project represents evolution beyond false dichotomies that have limited community development options for decades, noted the mayor during her remarks before the ribbon cutting. The integrated model pioneered here demonstrates how economic vitality, cultural preservation, and community well-being can be mutually reinforcing rather than competing priorities when development centers intergenerational wisdom alongside market mechanisms. As Jeffrey stepped forward to make remarks representing the development partnership, I reflected on remarkable evolution in both our personal relationship and his professional approach over these 5 years. While our fundamental values remained distinct, his continuing to prioritize market efficiency and financial sustainability while mine emphasized cultural continuity and community nourishment, mutual recognition had replaced dismissive opposition, creating collaborative approach, incorporating diverse perspectives within integrated framework. When the Heritage Table began 5 years ago, I viewed it primarily through traditional development metrics focused on property utilization efficiency and economic return, Jeffrey acknowledged with surprising candor to the assembled crowd. What this project has demonstrated, through measurable outcomes rather than merely philosophical arguments, is expanded framework for assessing community development success through complementary metrics beyond conventional financial calculations. His presentation included compelling data documenting neighborhood impacts extending beyond specific programming outcomes, housing stability figures showing decreased resident displacement despite rising regional property values, nutritional assessment metrics demonstrating improved health outcomes among neighborhood families participating in center programs, and economic development indicators tracking small business creation supported through culinary entrepreneurship, resources housed within the food campus. The Culinary Heritage Center we're opening today represents further evolution integrating economic development within community-centered approach, he explained, displaying architectural renderings highlighting how the design balanced preservation elements with contemporary function. The Food Entrepreneur Incubator provides business development resources traditionally available only in commercial districts, while heritage documentation programs create cultural preservation pipeline addressing both community knowledge retention and economic opportunity simultaneously. This framing, economic benefits alongside cultural preservation rather than privileging either exclusively, represented meaningful evolution beyond oppositional thinking that had characterized our initial conflict 5 years earlier. Jeffrey hadn't abandoned his market-oriented perspective, but had expanded its application to include complementary measurement systems capturing more comprehensive understanding of development impact beyond purely financial metrics. As the ribbon cutting proceeded amid enthusiastic community celebration, I found myself reflecting on journey that had brought us to this moment from that shocking Thanksgiving. The catalyst had been painful dismissal, hearing myself described as leftover from another era, while my son suggested I belonged with people my own age, rather than vibrant intergenerational community. Yet this rejection had ultimately revealed clarity about what truly mattered, creating opportunity for purpose beyond what might have remained comfortable but unfulfilled intentions. The wider impact. The afternoon following the ribbon cutting, the Heritage Table hosted Policy Roundtable, bringing together representatives from municipalities throughout the region to discuss community-centered development approaches addressing challenges beyond our specific neighborhood. The gathering reflected how what had begun as personal response to familial rejection had evolved into development model with applications addressing broader societal issues around cultural preservation, food security, and equitable development patterns. What makes this model particularly relevant for contemporary challenges is its integration of seemingly competing priorities into collaborative framework, noted the regional planning director during discussion exploring application across diverse contexts. Rather than positioning development interests against cultural preservation as inherently oppositional, this approach creates shared measurement systems acknowledging multiple valid perspectives on community vitality. This characterization, multiple valid frameworks measuring success rather than privileging any single metric exclusively, captured essential evolution in my own thinking alongside Jeffrey's over these 5 years. The initial conflict had positioned market values against cultural preservation as inherently opposing considerations, each side dismissing the other's perspective as either coldly calculating or impractically idealistic. What had emerged through implementation was recognition that complementary measurement systems captured more complete understanding of community health than either framework alone could provide. The data demonstrates correlation between cultural food heritage infrastructure and conventional economic indicators previously considered unrelated, Jeffrey contributed, his analytical precision now applied to expanded measurement framework, beyond purely financial calculations. Communities with robust food education resources, intergenerational programming, and heritage preservation spaces show measurably greater stability through market fluctuations, with corresponding benefits. For conventional economic metrics, including property values, business retention, and investment predictability. This perspective, cultural resources creating measurable economic benefits alongside less quantifiable social outcomes, provided bridge across value systems previously considered fundamentally incompatible. While Jeffrey continued viewing development, primarily through market lens, he now incorporated complementary metrics acknowledging cultural heritage infrastructure as meaningful component within comprehensive assessment framework, rather than merely sentimental consideration. As discussion continued exploring specific application across diverse neighborhood contexts, participants raised critical implementation questions addressing practical challenges beyond philosophical alignment. How could similar initiatives secure sustainable funding beyond initial philanthropic investment? What governance structures balanced institutional partnerships with genuine community participation? Which physical design approaches successfully integrated preservation priorities with contemporary function? These questions reflected evolution beyond simplistic opposition toward nuanced implementation challenges requiring diverse expertise. Exactly. The integrated approach our food campus now demonstrated through multiple completed projects representing different application contexts. The original restaurant renovation had established basic model. Subsequent additions had refined implementation addressing diverse priorities from cultural documentation to economic development while maintaining consistent community-centered approach. During working lunch where roundtable participants divided into implementation focus groups, I found myself seated with nutrition educators from throughout the region, exploring how the food campus model might address health equity challenges beyond our specific neighborhood context. The conversation highlighted another dimension of impact, extending from what had begun as personal dismissal. Application addressing systemic issues affecting communities throughout metropolitan area. What's particularly valuable about this model from nutritional perspective is integration of formal institutional resources with community culinary knowledge and relationships. Observed director from health department serving predominantly low-income neighborhoods. The partnership structure creates sustainability beyond what either community volunteers or institutional programs alone could maintain, while relationship-based implementation ensures programming remains responsive to actual resident food traditions, rather than impose solutions disconnected from cultural practices. This assessment, institutional resources made effective through community relationships, captured essential dynamic that distinguished our approach from either purely volunteer-driven efforts, eventually exhausting limited community capacity, or institutional programs lacking authentic resident engagement. The Heritage Table demonstrated sustainable alternative through reciprocal partnership framework, where each participating entity received legitimate value aligned with core mission, while collectively creating community resource beyond what any single organization could establish independently. By afternoon's end, working groups had developed preliminary implementation frameworks, adapting our model for specific applications throughout the region. From repurposing abandoned commercial kitchens in post-industrial neighborhoods to incorporating food heritage spaces within transit-oriented development projects along new rail corridors. What had begun as response to personal dismissal and community threat had evolved into replicable approach, addressing diverse challenges through common principles, balancing preservation with adaptation, institutional resources with community. participation, and economic development with cultural continuity. The family dimension. That evening, our family gathered for dinner at my home. Regular tradition established gradually over years following the initial conflict. While our Sunday meals had begun somewhat tentatively as carefully neutral ground for relationship repair, they had evolved into genuine connection points where multiple generations shared experiences across otherwise separate life dimensions. Most remarkably, the grandchildren had become bridge builders translating between different value systems represented by their father and grandmother, their natural integration of seemingly competing perspectives suggesting possibility beyond either-or thinking that had characterized our initial conflict. The Business Incubator program already has 20 applications for the first cohort, Madison reported enthusiastically, her growing involvement with the food campus reflecting integration of her father's business acumen with my cultural preservation values. 5 are from neighborhood residents who've never had access to conventional business development resources, despite viable concepts with potential market validation. At 17, Madison had developed remarkable capacity integrating different measurement frameworks without perceiving inherent contradiction between cultural impact and market viability. Her current project developing evaluation metrics for the entrepreneurship program reflected this integration, measuring success through both conventional business outcomes and community benefit indicators without privileging either exclusively. The program design incorporates market validation frameworks while addressing barriers preventing neighborhood residents from accessing conventional business development resources, she explained, her articulation reflecting sophistication beyond typical teenage enthusiasm. The evaluation captures both standard success metrics like revenue growth and sustainability, while measuring community impact through local hiring, nutritional education integration, and neighborhood economic circulation. Jeffrey listened with evident pride transcending any lingering disagreement about development priorities or neighborhood transformation approaches. Whatever philosophical differences remained between us regarding fundamental value systems, his recognition of Madison's capacity integrating different perspectives represented meaningful evolution beyond dismissive opposition, characterizing our initial conflict. The market analysis portion is quite sophisticated, he acknowledged with professional respect, rather than merely parental encouragement. The identification of specific barriers preventing viable concepts from accessing conventional development resources demonstrates legitimate market inefficiency. The program addresses through targeted intervention rather than general subsidy. This framing, market-based justification for community-centered approach, reflected Jeffrey's continuing evolution integrating different value systems within his core professional framework. While he still viewed development primarily through market lens, he now recognized community-centered approaches as potentially addressing legitimate market inefficiencies rather than merely representing sentimental attachment to outdated traditions or spaces. Tyler, now 20 and pursuing professional culinary training that balanced contemporary techniques with traditional methods, contributed perspective-bridging professional standards with cultural wisdom. The certification program integrating heritage cooking techniques with contemporary food safety standards creates professional pathway incorporating cultural knowledge traditionally excluded from mainstream culinary education. These aren't opposing approaches, but complementary knowledge systems creating more comprehensive culinary understanding. As dinner conversation continued ranging across family matters, community developments, and broader societal issues, I reflected on remarkable healing that had occurred despite remaining differences in fundamental values and priorities. Jeffrey would never fully embrace cultural preservation as primary metric replacing market considerations in his development approach. I would continue measuring success primarily through intergenerational connection and community nourishment, rather than financial calculations. Yet mutual recognition had replaced dismissive opposition, creating space for collaboration transcending binary thinking that had characterized our initial conflict. Most meaningfully, This evolution had created legacy extending beyond either personal property transmission or professional accomplishment alone. The grandchildren were developing capacity, integrating seemingly competing value systems into complementary framework, acknowledging multiple valid perspectives on community vitality and personal success beyond either-or thinking. This integration, respecting both market efficiency and cultural continuity as legitimate considerations without absolute prioritization, represented perhaps the most significant transformation emerging from what had begun as painful dismissal and rejection. Diane, who had initiated healing process through behind-the-scenes encouragement following our initial conflict, offered observation capturing this intergenerational bridging function. The children have absorbed valuable perspectives from both their father's business understanding and your cultural preservation work. They naturally integrate these approaches without seeing the contradictions that our generation perceives between different value systems. The personal evolution. Later that evening, after family departed, I sat in my kitchen reflecting on a remarkable journey from that traumatic Thanksgiving, hearing myself dismissed as mere leftover from another era, unworthy of voice in contemporary development conversations. The rejection had been profound, not just personal dismissal, but fundamental devaluation of elder wisdom and cultural knowledge, representing decades of community experience and connection. Yet this painful experience had ultimately revealed clarity and purpose that might otherwise have remained dormant beneath comfortable routines and good intentions. The threatened loss of both personal dignity and community heritage had crystallized understanding about what truly mattered. Not property ownership or market value, but cultural wisdom and shared purpose creating community identity beyond commercial development metrics. This clarity had led not just to successful defense against dismissal, but creation of something far more significant than personal vindication alone. The Heritage Table had demonstrated alternative development approach, measuring community vitality through cultural preservation, intergenerational connection, and shared purpose alongside conventional market metrics typically dominating planning decisions. The model had evolved through multiple implementation phases, demonstrating application across diverse contexts while maintaining consistent community-centered principles. Most remarkably, this journey had transformed my understanding of legacy beyond conventional inheritance frameworks, privileging property transmission or financial security exclusively. While material resources provided necessary foundation for community initiatives and personal security, meaningful legacy emerged through values demonstrated and purpose created rather than merely assets transferred between generations. The grandchildren had received something more valuable than either property inheritance or financial security alone. Lived demonstration of purposeful response, transforming dismissal into creative opportunity serving needs beyond individual circumstances. Madison's integration of business acumen with community purpose, Tyler's combination of culinary innovation with cultural preservation. These represented legacy transcending material resources or professional accomplishment alone. At 78, this understanding provided remarkable freedom from attachment while maintaining appreciation for material foundations supporting purposeful engagement. My home remained precious as both personal sanctuary and physical embodiment of values, Thomas and I had demonstrated throughout our lives together. Yet identity and security existed beyond any particular property or location through relationships and purpose that would continue regardless of eventual transitions inevitable through aging process. When I eventually required care beyond independent living capacity, this understanding would provide graceful transition rather than traumatic displacement, not because circumstances would differ fundamentally, but because meaning and identity existed beyond particular physical arrangement or property control. Legacy would continue through relationships and purpose, regardless of specific location or living configuration. The regional model. The following month brought unexpected validation of the food campus model's significance beyond our specific community. Context: Regional Planning Commission incorporated cultural food heritage designation into comprehensive development framework, creating formal recognition and implementation support for spaces demonstrating integrated approach similar to our heritage table model. The designation provided both regulatory protection and implementation resources for community culinary centers throughout metropolitan area, acknowledging their essential contribution to neighborhood vitality alongside more conventional infrastructure. Considerations: The Commission's formal report specifically cited data from our 5-year implementation, documenting correlation between community culinary resources and conventional neighborhood stability metrics. Properties within quarter-mile radius of established cultural food centers demonstrated measurably greater stability through market fluctuations, with corresponding benefits for traditional economic indicators including property values, business retention, and investment predictability. These findings suggest cultural food heritage infrastructure represents essential component within comprehensive neighborhood development strategy rather than merely supplemental amenity. This characterization, essential infrastructure rather than optional amenity, represented significant evolution in development framework beyond our specific implementation. What had begun as defensive response to personal dismissal and community threat had evolved into recognized component within regional planning approach, addressing challenges throughout metropolitan area. When Regional Foundation convened implementation summit bringing together community organizations, institutional partners, and municipal representatives to expand the model, I found myself seated beside Jeffrey on expert panel discussing essential elements for successful adaptation across diverse contexts. Our different perspectives, his emphasizing market sustainability and financial structure while mine focused on community engagement and cultural preservation, now represented complementary expertise rather than opposing positions. The economic analysis demonstrates correlation between cultural food heritage infrastructure and neighborhood stability metrics. Conventional development frameworks typically consider unrelated, Jeffrey explained, presenting data tracking property values, business retention, and investment patterns surrounding established culinary centers. These findings suggest community food resources represent legitimate market consideration within comprehensive development strategy, rather than merely social benefit separate from economic fundamentals. My contribution complemented this market analysis with implementation principles addressing community engagement beyond transactional consultation. Sustainable centers require governance structure balancing institutional resources with authentic resident participation beyond token representation. The reciprocal partnership framework ensures programming remains responsive to actual community traditions, while leveraging institutional capacity beyond what volunteer efforts alone could maintain. Our integrated presentation, linking market considerations with cultural preservation through complementary rather than oppositional framework, reflected evolution beyond binary thinking that had characterized our initial conflict 5 years earlier. The audience response confirmed recognition that false dichotomy between market-driven development and community preservation limited potential solutions addressing contemporary challenges facing neighborhoods throughout our region. What makes this model particularly valuable for current implementation challenges is integration of diverse measurement frameworks beyond conventional development metrics, noted Foundation Director summarizing discussion. The documented correlation between cultural food heritage infrastructure and neighborhood stability suggests different development approach worth exploring from market perspective while advancing social objectives beyond commercial considerations. This assessment, acknowledging multiple valid frameworks measuring neighborhood vitality rather than privileging either market or community metrics exclusively, captured essential evolution in development thinking our food campus had demonstrated through measurable outcomes rather than merely philosophical argument. The model provided practical implementation pathway, integrating seemingly competing priorities into collaborative approach, addressing challenges throughout metropolitan area. The final reflection. 10 years after that shocking Thanksgiving dinner, when I'd been casually dismissed as leftover from another era, I stood in the food campus central garden watching community gatherings celebrating decade of transformation, extending far beyond our initial vision. What had begun as desperate response to personal dismissal had evolved into neighborhood revitalization approach, replicated throughout our region, while demonstrating development model, integrating preservation with adaptation, institutional resources, with community participation, and economic development with cultural continuity. The campus now encompassed multiple properties serving diverse educational and community functions, while maintaining cohesive identity through consistent design principles and integrated programming. The original restaurant remained literal and figurative heart of the complex, its historic character preserved while interior spaces continued evolving to serve contemporary educational needs. Surrounding buildings demonstrated different application contexts from historic preservation to new construction, each maintaining consistent community-centered approach while addressing specific functional requirements and neighborhood context. Considerations. Most remarkably, the campus had expanded to include property adjacent to my home that Jeffrey's company had initially targeted for luxury condominium development when orchestrating plans near my property. The tract connecting to original restaurant, once designated for upscale housing supporting commercial development, now housed intergenerational culinary residency program, combining elder knowledge with culinary innovation through collaborative design, creating natural mentoring relationships and shared learning spaces. The project represented perhaps the most meaningful evolution in our journey from conflict to collaboration, its integrated approach reflecting both market viability and cultural purpose through complementary rather than oppositional framework. See. Community gathering continued around me. Familiar faces representing decade of shared purpose acknowledged my presence with genuine appreciation, transcending mere politeness. Teachers whose classroom nutrition education had been transformed through community practicums, seniors whose isolation had been replaced through intergenerational programming, entrepreneurs whose businesses had developed through incubator resources, all represented living testimony to impact extending beyond specific programs or services to fundamental transformation in how community defined itself and measured success beyond conventional metrics. Madison joined me, now 22, and recently graduated with dual degrees in business and cultural anthropology that perfectly symbolized integration beyond false dichotomies, separating market considerations from cultural preservation. Her current role, developing similar centers in underserved neighborhoods throughout metropolitan area, represented legacy extending beyond either property inheritance or professional accomplishment alone, purposeful application of capacity integrating seemingly competing value systems into complementary framework addressing contemporary challenges through multiple valid perspectives. "Can you believe this all started with that awful comment about you being a leftover?" she marveled. Her awareness of our journey's beginning, maintained through family narrative without bitterness or resentment, clouding its transformative significance. Dad was telling potential partners yesterday how his perspective completely transformed through watching this place evolve from concept he initially opposed into model he's now helping implement throughout the region. Jeffrey's evolution, from dismissing me as irrelevant to collaborating on implementation, expanding the model, represented perhaps the most remarkable transformation in our journey. While our fundamental values remained distinct, mutual recognition had replaced dismissive opposition, creating collaborative approach, incorporating diverse perspectives within integrated framework, addressing challenges neither approach alone could adequately resolve. The comment about being leftover actually contained unintentional wisdom, I reflected, watching community members of all ages engaged in activities throughout the campus with evident ownership, transcending mere participation. Traditional cooking understood that yesterday's meal ingredients often became foundation for today's more complex and nourishing dishes when skillfully repurposed with fresh perspectives. This understanding, leftovers as foundation for new, Creation, rather than diminished remnants, represented perhaps the most profound personal transformation emerging from Journey that had begun with shocking dismissal and betrayal. While rightful indignation had initially motivated defense against improper devaluation, deeper insight had emerged through creating alternative demonstrating continued relevance and value of traditional wisdom within contemporary context. As that afternoon transitioned toward evening, the gathering evolved into celebration featuring performances, exhibits, and demonstrations representing diverse programs housed throughout the food campus. The central dining area filled with tables for community meal where residents shared dishes reflecting neighborhood's cultural heritage, while student documentation team captured oral histories from longtime community members for digital archive, preserving neighborhood culinary evolution through resident perspectives, alongside formal documentation. Jeffrey appeared with Diane and Tyler, now 25 and developing restaurant concept reflecting integration of heritage cooking techniques with contemporary presentation that symbolized another dimension of values transmission beyond either commercial dining or traditional cookery exclusively. Their presence represented not just family reconciliation, but evolution beyond binary thinking that had characterized our initial conflict toward recognition that multiple valid perspectives could coexist within integrated framework. The new mixed-use project incorporating community food space breaks ground next month, Jeffrey mentioned after family greetings, his professional updates now shared with genuine recognition of my interest rather than mere politeness. The financing structure incorporates elements from campus model here while adapting for specific neighborhood context and institutional partnerships available in that area. This evolution, adapting core principles for different implementation, context rather than imposing standardized approach, reflected sophisticated understanding beyond either market determinism or cultural preservation absolutism. Development addressing contemporary challenges required nuanced application balancing, preservation with adaptation, institutional resources with community participation, and economic development with cultural continuity through context-specific implementation rather than rigid ideological framework. As evening continued with community performances representing diverse culinary traditions within our neighborhood, I reflected on remarkable journey from devastation to creation that had defined these 10 years. The dismissal as leftover from another era had triggered response creating something none of us had initially imagined. Demonstration that community development could measure success through metrics beyond market value while establishing model, replicable beyond our specific circumstances. Legacy existed not just through property transmission or financial security, but values demonstrated and purpose created extending beyond individual circumstances to address broader societal challenges. The food campus represented tangible embodiment of this understanding, physical manifestation of response, transforming dismissal into opportunity serving needs beyond personal vindication or property reclamation. Sometimes life's most profound purpose emerges through circumstances initially experienced solely as painful rejection rather than opportunity for meaningful creation. The dismissal that had wounded me at Thanksgiving had ultimately revealed clarity about what truly mattered, creating catalyst for transformation extending far beyond personal circumstances or property dispute to demonstrate development approach, measuring success through cultural continuity and shared purpose alongside conventional market metrics. As I prepared to depart the celebration, community members of all ages approached with appreciation, transcending mere politeness to acknowledge shared journey extending beyond specific programs or services. Their expressions reflected recognition that the food campus represented more than successful culinary center or preservation victory. It demonstrated possibility beyond false dichotomies, limiting potential solutions addressing contemporary challenges through integrated approach, honoring multiple valid perspectives on what creates truly thriving communities and meaningful legacy. The casual comment that had dismissed me as just a leftover from another era 10 years earlier had ultimately produced exactly the opposite of its intended devaluation. Creation of community legacy, demonstrating continued relevance of cultural wisdom, reintegrated through contemporary applications, serving essential needs far beyond individual circumstances or private property considerations. When I heard that painful dismissal at Thanksgiving dinner, I could never have anticipated how that wounding moment would ultimately lead to community transformation and personal evolution far more meaningful than mere vindication or property victory. The heritage table now stands as living testimony to possibility of creating meaning from dismissal, purpose from devaluation, and community benefit from what might otherwise have been merely personal rejection, measuring value solely through market metrics alone. As new generations continue building upon foundations we established, they create their own adaptations, integrating traditional wisdom with contemporary needs, proving that leftovers represent not diminished remnants from irrelevant past, but essential ingredients for creating more complex, nourishing future. When skillfully transformed through wisdom that spans generations,